Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. Sue Anstiss MBE is the director and producer of Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport, the hugely powerful documentary that began airing on Netflix in June this year. She's an author, podcast host, and women's sport activist who's driven change in sport for over 30 years. Sue is the co-founder of the Women's Sport Collective and a founding trustee of the Women's Sport Trust, and in 2018 received an MBE for her services to women's sport. She's the author of Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport, which was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Sports Book Awards and longlisted for the William Hill Sports Book of the Year. She's the creator and host of The Game Changers, an award-winning podcast that celebrates trailblazing women in sport. In 2023, Sue was recognised in BBC Women's Hour Power List as one of the 30 outstanding women in sport, having been shortlisted for the Sunday Times Changemaker of the Year Award in 2021, when she also received a Distinguished Alumni Award from Loughborough University for her work in driving equality in women's sport. Sue sits on England Rugby's Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group, is a trustee at Leisure Focus, a charity running leisure facilities in Berkshire, and is a member of the Advisory Group for Inclusive Sportswear. Coming late to the sport of triathlon, Sue represented Great Britain as an age group triathlete, competing at World and European Championships in her 40s. I made the Game On documentary to celebrate the incredible growth in women's sport, whilst also highlighting the continuing disparities faced by female athletes. There's enormous potential in women's sport that many don't yet see. Things are changing fast, with significant increases in investment and visibility, but there's still much to do to ensure true equality for all women and girls. I hope that Game On will amplify the story of women's sport and its potential to impact gender equality in society. Being on Netflix will help us to do this, as it provides tremendous reach beyond current fans of women's sport. Sue Anstiss first appeared on the Extrology podcast way back in November 2020 on episode 8, where amongst other things, we chatted over the status of women's sport as it was in 2020 and the support being channeled into creating more opportunities for women. Clearly, she's been busier than ever since. But how has she seen things really change? Without further ado, let's get into it. Sue Anstiss, I want to start by saying welcome back. If perhaps for some an unfamiliar way to start the Extrology podcast, but nonetheless, we've been here before. It's been an incredibly busy 3 years for you, and certainly that's something we're going to discuss at length. But as I say, welcome back. Great to have you.
Thank you. Privileged to be back on it. I think I must need to talk to you more often if all that's happened since I was last here. So you've obviously had a great impact.
Well, I'm more than happy to take credit, Sue. So, as is my way. No, absolutely. Fascinating journey this last 3 years. And so much has gone on, not least of which, of course, has been Game On, a Netflix documentary, which when I first read of it and then subsequently watched it, I was just blown away. And I just think it's such a wonderful story and thing to have achieved that I'm really fascinated to find out more. So I guess first and foremost, what inspired you to make the Game On documentary?
Yeah, I almost feel I can't quite take credit for it, although it is my documentary. But it's actually Jack Tompkins, who is the co-director with me. And I worked with him in the past on other content. No Woman, No Try, another documentary that I had a small part in. But actually he and Ben Marlow, his partner, have done a lot in the world of sports documentaries. And when I've written the book, we talked a lot around, wouldn't it be amazing to take the book and make that would be great documentary? And for a long time, I think I was a bit overwhelmed. I mean, the book's, 86,000 words. I mean, it's a lot of content in the book. So how do you take that and make that into a 1 hour engaging storyline to capture it? So it was really there persuading me that it would be a great thing to do, that I almost needed that. So I don't quite take credit for the idea, but obviously then as soon as the seed was planted, I was really excited to make that happen.
Did you need much persuasion? At what point did you kind of go, yeah, I'm in?
No, I think I was in early, but we had a few, not false starts. I think we kept stopping and starting of like, where do we even go with this? There's just so many topics to cover. And, you think about all those kind of different subject areas around women's sport. And I think it was a bit overwhelming of how do you condense that into an hour's documentary. And I it's lovely that you have enjoyed it. We've had such positive feedback. So clearly we were able to condense a lot of that into an hour, but still make people feel it was engaging and not too fast moving. But I think that was the piece for me at the beginning was what do you leave out? How can you make that into a really comprehensible 1 hour to put all of women's sport and the growth of and the history of and all the issues into an hour's documentary?
To your point, how do you do that? Because 86,000 words, it's an awful lot of content, but also there are an awful lot of issues, right? It strikes me. There's not one overarching burning issue. It's a whole host of things that need to be addressed of equal measure, arguably. How do you go about discerning, I guess not only, because they're all important. I was going to say what's important, but they're all important. How do you go about thinking what are the issues that will really resonate in a documentary format? I guess, is that the more pertinent question?
And I think it probably came about, we followed a few storylines through the documentary. So following the success of the Euros, the Lionesses at the Euros, the Women's Rugby World Cup over in New Zealand. And so Poppy Cleall's journey to that. And then the Katie Taylor, Amanda Serrano fight in Madison Square Gardens. We followed a few netball Super Leagues. We had a few sports, not massive. There's not a huge amount of sports coverage in there, but there is some sports. So I think following those journeys, talking to those key players, and what is really interesting, like giving away all of Jack's trade secrets here. They've always said to me, and it's like my first documentary, so to actually direct and produce too. But if it doesn't change as you're making it, you're not listening, that actually you can come to it with a plan. And we had a plan, but that being reassured that actually it will evolve. So a lot of it, obviously we had access to amazing, amazing women and women in Yugo, but women in it. So Claire Balding and Denise Lewis and Tanya Gray Thompson. So in those conversations, and actually someone like Ali Bowes, who just knows so much from a sociology of sport perspective, but going and having those conversations, and then you come back in each case with an hour, 2 hours of content, and then I guess listening to what they've said and shaping that. So it definitely, we had a clear plan of where it would go, but then it kind of evolved in a natural way. And I think that's what makes it enjoyable to watch, is it is authentic. We haven't, I don't feel it's like forced into, we're going to talk about this issue, so we've gone to get these people to say these things. We've gone with what the issues they highlighted. And I guess, we'll take some praise for it, but it's like Jack's work on editing. So then to have Laura Woods talk about something that then leads into some amazing B-roll with coverage, and then Stacey comments, and then so it's almost like illustrating the things that you're saying with the amazing content. So the access that we were given by England Netball and the RFU to go into camp and go to Stanley Park, that made a massive difference to have that fabulous footage.
I mean, one of the questions inevitably that sprung to mind is, where do you start? Because your point, you've got access to really talented people who are speaking of their experiences, which I think is invaluable. It gives then you're seeing a real authenticity when you're actually hearing it, genuine experiences from those individuals who've been participants or are actively involved at the forefront of, whether that through broadcasting, whatever mechanism it might be. But where do you start to actually, what's the process from a practical perspective of going, right, day one, we're now making a Netflix documentary. For many of us, many listeners, certainly me, I've never been through that process. What does it look like? What does day one making a Netflix documentary actually entail?
And I guess the thing is, we weren't making a Netflix documentary to start with. That is an interesting point to make. So it wasn't. So when we first had the idea, we create like a treatment, like a proposal, take that out to all the broadcasters and say, this is what we're looking at. This is the storyline. A little bit of I think we had a sizzle reel there. So later on, we had a bit of a few bits of content from the shoots we'd done. But that early stage, we've just got pictures of who's going to be in it, a plan of what it might look like, the storyline, and why we're the people to make this with our expertise in different areas. And we took that out and no one wanted it. So that's the truth of it, is we took it out to I won't list the broadcasters, but every broadcaster, streamer, platform, terrestrial, international we could think of, and nobody wanted it. And we decided, well, we'll go ahead and make it anyway, because actually we were really committed to it. We felt it was if you look across at the different kind of platforms and you look at their tiles of all the different sports documentaries, there's very little on women's sport. So we felt we wanted to redress that balance. There was a story to be told there. We knew the book had done really well. We knew there was an interest. It's a growing area. So we thought we'll make it anyway and then go back to them afterwards and see. So you kind of either sell it that it's commissioned by one of those platforms and they pay you to go and make it, or you just make it yourself. And when you take it back, they then acquire it. So that's what we did. We just made it ourselves in the hope that somebody would take it when it was done. And if that hadn't happened, it probably would have just gone onto YouTube, onto our channel. It would still have existed as a fabulous piece of content. So when it was then made, we then went back out to all those same people, and a few were interested then. And some said it was beautiful, and it was, all those things. It's all very lovely when they then saw it. And Netflix wanted it, and it was Netflix that we'd always wanted from the start. So Jack and Ben have made stuff. They've been on Amazon Prime and BBC, which is and they're fantastic, all fantastic channels with different audiences. And I think at one point I was really excited about the BBC because I thought that, that's what I've grown up with and that's what I love. But actually Netflix was where we, even from the beginning of deciding which cameras we were using and the shots we were doing and the way in which it was made for Netflix, even though we didn't know where it was going to go. So the decisions we made about how we filmed and the captions that we used and the way in which we shot, it was almost made as if it was being made for Netflix. So when Netflix said they wanted to take it, acquire it, obviously it was a pretty amazing day for us. So it's just getting it to a place that it wouldn't otherwise have got to had it been on even ITV or BBC or Channel 4 would have been amazing. But I think the brand of Netflix and the association of Netflix, and because they've done so much in the area, I spend most of my evenings watching sports documentaries on Netflix. So we just knew we would reach a much different audience and that younger audience too.
And absolutely, I wouldn't accept your premise around not naming names, and I understand that entirely. Did you get any feedback as to those that didn't want it, why? And two questions in one, I think, never a good premise, but I'm going to do it anyway. There's partly why they didn't want it. Part of me leads me to think, what does that tell us about the subject matter? Is that a lazy assumption I'm making there?
No, absolutely. And I'm careful what I say because we are making more content and talking to those broadcasters right now. So they're all wonderful and they've all got a great place and I'd love to work with them all. So because one of the messages that we did here, I think we weren't helped by the fact that the Euros had just happened and there were lots of people pitching lots of women's football content at that time. So there isn't much women's sport content out there, but it was kind of a busy time. There seemed to be a lot that was coming, and the World Cup was coming the next year too. So we were kind of in that window between Euros and World Cup. So there was quite a lot of people punting stuff around in the area of women's football and the Lionesses. But also what we did hear a bit, and we have talked about this in the past, is there's almost that thing of content needs to be led by names. You want a well-known household name, celebrity to lead the piece, and then you hook the story around that well-known person. And the problem for women's sport is where they're not that well-known as much as the men's, because they haven't had this coverage. So it's like the cyclical thing of until you can give them the coverage and then they're seen in households and they are recognised and they're well known, but you're not taking these documentaries that may feature less well-known women doesn't help that to change in the future either too. So it's almost a bit of a actually, if you go with that rule, you'll only ever feature men from sports that have been around for 150 years that are well established and well known, or a few Olympians, tennis players, etc. from the female side. So that's almost like a difficult argument. And I do know, it's true that men don't read books by women as much as women read books by men and women. And they don't watch content. Men don't watch don't like female comedy. So it's not just me saying that anecdotally. Within society, men don't consume content that is created by women in the way that women consume created by men and women. So I think you're almost on a bit of from a broadcaster perspective, it's like, will this have as much success as a documentary made by a man about men's sport for men? That the audience then is men and women, so I do think you suffer a little bit with that. But I guess that isn't a reason not to do it, because we're trying to change those perceptions. And the feedback that I've had from the men that have watched it is it's amazing, and it's opened their eyes to things, and it's changed their minds on things, and it's great, amazing content and fabulous sport. But I'm not sure how many men would come down and, I think men are watching it with wives, daughters, sisters, or because they're in sport, or because they're a bit more progressive and they are interested in it. But actually, I'm not sure whether a guy sat down and looking at Sunderland Till I Die, Wrexham, whatever, whether he would choose Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport as something to draw him in. You know, so it's interesting. But that, as I say, that's not a reason not to make it, in my opinion, because we need to drive that change and to put good content out there.
It struck me. I'm struck about, you know, to your point, it's sort of chicken and egg, isn't it? It's like, well, if you don't raise the awareness, if you don't give the profile, if you don't give the platform, then you're never going to break that cycle of well, we don't watch it as much. I was just reflecting on the issue of the Women's World Cup with a certain sports kit manufacturer who decided not to sell the England goalkeeper's shirt because I guess they didn't think it was commercially a sensible move to make. Yet Mary Earps is arguably, I mean, she's a superstar, right? Yeah. it's like you sort of look at it and you go, okay, that's an interesting move. I know they subsequently addressed that balance as I understand it, but it does strike me. There's that sort of chicken and egg. If you don't give it the profile, it's never going to get there in the first place. Are you seeing, if we reflect back on the last 3 years, are you starting to see that shift? I'm thinking as to I'm a huge football fan, so I would draw those analogies. I think of the impact of the Lionesses. I look at the impact of the World Cup. We'll come on to some of the issues that arose from that. But if I look at, because I consume a lot of football-related content, there's constant discussion now, or not constant, there's far more discussion around, for example, WSL. And it seems far more available on my screen than ever it was. But that might just be because I never used to see it and now I'm seeing a little bit of it. But have you seen a shift? Have you seen?
There's been a huge shift, yeah. Significant. So significant shift in coverage. So because of the BBC and Sky coming together, especially for the WSL, but also the extensive coverage we had for the Euros, across BBC and iPlayer and all those places that it's being seen. And the same for the World Cup, although the time difference didn't help there. But it's that. And then it's the games being played in stadia that are full stadia and that feeds, and then it's about sponsors. So we've got a lot more data than we've ever had before, and a lot of that's due to the work of the Women's Sport Trust, who are constantly researching who is the audience, where are they coming from, what are they watching, what are they not watching, and then feeding that out to sponsorship agencies. And I was with one just this week actually saying it's made such a difference to them going and talking to sponsors and having those stats and that data about who the audience is, how it's growing, where it's coming from, to get those sponsors on board in women's sport, which then drives professional contracts and funding, and then improves strength and conditioning, as well as everything that sits around looking after your female athletes to improve play, to attract more fans. So it does feel like that's the cycle that we are now seeing. And and it is fantastic. And it definitely has changed in football. And there's lots we could talk about with football, isn't there? I sometimes get concerned that it's so much of it is about football, which is brilliant and fantastic, and a rising tide floats all boats, blah, blah, blah. It is good for all women's sport, without doubt. But there is a little bit at the back of my head of our other sports. There's a danger that other sports get left behind in the way that men's football and Premier League has just blown everything out the water in terms of coverage and print coverage and, TV coverage and sponsorship and funding and broadcast rights. So there's not enough left for other magnificent sports that are out there. So I do get a little concerned that women's football is on potentially on a path. Obviously, I'm a massive, massive rugby fan. I do a lot of work in rugby, but also within cricket and with netball. And, I was at the women's basketball, actually, London Lions this week. It was an amazing game of basketball there. But other sports that not miss out on sponsorship. You hope that actually what football's doing is bringing sponsors to women's sport as a whole entity, and then it trickles out to other sports. So we are seeing that. Yeah. I guess I have a little word of caution of we don't need to do what we did in men's football, in women's too.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I have to sort of almost go with that. There's also an element of unconscious bias, if you like, with me. Football is I love all sports, but particularly football, and therefore I naturally watch and consume football content. I could be led to believe it's the only sport on the planet. It'd be very easy.
It's not. Let me reassure you, Lee. It's not.
Absolutely. And I love a lot of other sports. I watch a lot of other sports as well. It just tends to be my go-to. But to your point, therefore, and one of the things with the documentary was, and you'd alluded to this, as to the different sports that you'd highlighted. You mentioned netball, boxing. How did you decide on the content and the stories to include in Game On?
Yeah, a bit of what was happening at the time, and a little bit of where I was going in my practice. It started out as a documentary that followed the topics, and I was going to go and talk to the people and interview. So I'm actually not on camera in some of the interviews, you might notice if you watch really carefully. And then I am in later, because as we went through, it kind of evolved to follow me more. And I think it's a bit of that whole, I guess I spent much of my career being the amplifier of sharing the stories of other women and interviewing. And so it's kind of odd to put yourself forward as actually, this is my story too. But as we filmed, that is what it became, because it has got elements of my life within sport and how that's reflected in the sports I'm now working in as well. So a bit of it was where I was going to. So I was actually at the first netball game we went to, I was there in the crowd, and then at the rugby and in the kind of following all those things through. So a bit of it was what my passion was and what were the big events in that year. So because it was the Euros and because it was the World Cup and, caught the end of the Netball Super League, there probably wasn't enough. If I was doing it over more cricket, I would have liked to have done. We did film with some youngsters out in Slough playing cricket. So some of the B-roll is women's cricket, but we didn't really feature women's cricket. But that's probably just because we weren't able to, the events weren't happening at that time in the country and all those things too. So it was a bit about the people that we spoke to, but also probably the sports that I'm familiar with, where I felt I could talk with some authority, and the people that we were interviewing knew of those sports too. And obviously the football, because we wanted to look back at the history of the FA ban and how that now impacted, and it was right. So we couldn't not include football with the Euros happening while we were filming.
And I guess in terms of production, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced during production?
Yeah, I think, as I said, it's that whole, what do you leave in, what do you not film with? I mean, everyone was so kind. Like everybody that's featured in it, I emailed around and said, would you like to take part? People just gave their time, invited us into their homes, into their offices, so actually there were some expenses of booking venues, etc. But generally, people were so generous with everything. I think licensing is really expensive. It's almost a thing you don't think about in making an amazing documentary. So having access to archive footage and also to footage that's gone out. So almost getting to a point where we might be self-funding, we are self-funding it. And then it's like, oh my God, how much is it going to cost us to share that footage from the Euros? How do we get the rights to that? And how much of those, anyway, I won't go through details, but the photos of even the archive footage of the Dick Kerr ladies was really, really expensive. And we went to a different route to get it slightly, but thousands of pounds to have that in there. And I remember talking with a lovely young footballer down at Sussex Uni. We did a bit of an early thing, and they said actually just to see that footage of the Dick Kerr ladies was so moving, because they'd read about them, but to see them in action was so powerful. And that was one of the early people that saw it. And I thought, okay, that's great. It was worth the investment of not just having stills, but actually paying for that footage. So, and I would just flag, actually, I've mentioned, so how collaborative people were. So we did pay, it wasn't the FA, we had to pay UEFA for the Euros footage. But so the lovely boxing, the Katie Taylor, Amanda Serrano, is like the most amazing. It's a piece of the documentary makes my husband cry when he watches it at the end. It just gives me goosebumps thinking about it now. And also when Laura Woods is describing Katie Taylor's walk on and how much it moves Stacey and takes her back to her childhood. So we got the documentary made, and then it's like, oh my God, how much are we going to have to pay for that footage? Because it's Madison Square Garden. Anyway, so it was like the whole tentative, and you had to hunt around to find who you got to ask for it. And it was DAZN. And they were so lovely. And they let us have it for nothing. They let us license it, not have to pay for it, because they knew it was self-funded, and because they, I guess, saw how authentic we were in the storytelling and why we wanted it and how important it was to the documentary. So yeah, I kind of shout out to them of probably something that didn't mean much to them. They could have charged us, they could have not charged us. It's almost like whatever your job's worth. But the lovely guy, Joe Harper at DAZN, said, Archie, you can have it. And I don't know whether he would know the impact that enabled us to then keep it in, and it's such an important part of the documentary. So in terms of, I guess, challenges, sometimes it's those bits that you hadn't really, you have this ideal world of what you'd love in it, but actually it is the showing other people's footage can be the bit that's really expensive.
And I guess the impact, if you like, and the response that you might have had since Game On was released, what kind of impact or responses have you seen or heard?
Yeah, really, people are really emotional about it. And I think you get so close to it because I got so close to it, and I watched it so many times, and constantly editing a little bit here, a little bit there, and then almost Jack, we haven't got enough about whatever, the commercial side. So going and filming a bit more and looking back at the archives. So I think we get so close to it that almost when it came out, I was like, actually, how good is it? Really any good? How good is it? It was really funny. So I think then you're waiting, thinking someone's like something you know so well. And we did have actually we emailed it out to a few people, like a screener, and a fantastic guy, head of sport at Channel 4, came back, and He said it was beautiful. He said it's beautiful and powerful. And the beautiful bit, so it was like the first feedback we'd had from, I had feedback from friends and family who were always going to tell me it was lovely. But that first, and again, he would never know that, but I can remember where I was when I opened his email and he said it's a beautiful, powerful piece of content. It's like, wow, somebody that knows their stuff thinks it's really beautiful. So that was very powerful. But actually the emails that I get and the direct messages on Instagram, whatever, from people who are either female athletes who feel their story is finally being told, or men who feel differently about how they're going to talk about sport in the family. They thought they were really great dads and allies, but they're going to change that. Or just people saying it, you know, and that thing is a beautiful end, because that's part of it, isn't it? Is it entertaining and engaging, as well as you don't want it just to be have social purpose and tell a story. You want it to be a good watch too. So I think, yeah, that's really powerful. And I do more messages now, that I send more people messages of things I consume to say this is great. Because I think people think that you get loads of messages all the time, and you don't. But when you do, it is so powerful. So we've got a little WhatsApp group where I share them with the rest of the team to say, look at the impact it's having. But yeah, that's extraordinary, really, you forget it's every individual person that it's touching as they watch it in a different way. They're taking different things from it.
And the rise of women's sport, I'm conscious, or I'm curious as to how, you know, look at my sort of UK-centric my lens is, or perhaps even England-centric, given my reference to football and the success that the Lionesses have enjoyed. And other sports as well. I look at the success of the England netball team. I happened to be watching the women's cricket against Sri Lanka last week, and thinking, watching that and thinking, and then you go into, you know, look at it through, albeit one of the things I think is often a challenge here in the UK, regardless of gender, is, you know, we love a tall poppy. I look at Emma Raducanu and the success she's enjoyed. It's kind of like, now we've built her up, we need to knock her down a little bit because she might just get a little too big for her boots, or whatever the expression might be. Nonsense, but nonetheless, if I look at I sometimes think, well, I see the rise, if you like, of women's sport is very evident to me on my screen, on my, you know, on my radio, on my, you know, my news content. I see it. I see it at a participatory level. I anecdotally hear it from I have a daughter. I have friends who've daughters. Their participation level, they feel that there are more opportunities. But these are all anecdotal. And I often reflect and think, am I looking at this through a somewhat privileged lens? You know, maybe is this a UK or even England-centric thing? There's still a lot of work to do. Are there other parts of the world that are doing it much better than us? Are there other parts of the world where the challenges are even more significant? So I have lots of questions around. What's your experience? Is this a UK doing well could do better thing, or actually is the globe kind of, is this rise of women's sport a global phenomenon?
Yeah, it is definitely a global phenomenon. Actually, that's something I'm sometimes almost, who's doing it well? Who in the world is doing it well? Are we doing it best? So I think it's different by different sports and in different regions. So if you look at Australia, obviously the success of the Matildas and how far they got through the World Cup, but cricket-wise, they've done so well in the past, and rugby, you know, there's so in certain, netball, and obviously right, the Big Bash, and then absolutely the netball. Yeah, I'd mention that. Yeah. So each country's got to, and the same in the US. If you look at the growth of soccer, you know, through Title IX way back when in the 70s, but that whole change in college sport, by how much money comes into the sport, and then their success through multiple World Cups, etc. So that might have, you know, again, things change slightly, but the growth of the NWSL as their professional league, and the clubs and the coverage and so again, there has been huge growth. So yeah, it's not just a kind of UK success, it is globally. But then go back to the other part of the question, it is good. But in terms of activity, we've still got a mass of teenage girls dropping out of sport at twice the rate of boys of the similar age. And so there are more opportunities, and things definitely have changed. I do feel when you talk to athletes, it's definitely not necessarily completely the right cool thing to do, but it's definitely more so than it was when I was growing up, or even in the last 15 years, in terms of being strong and powerful and fit and sweaty. And that definitely feels like it's more accepted and celebrated for girls than it has been. The fact that we're talking about periods and whites and clothing and puberty and why girls drop out of sports. So I think we're certainly having those conversations in a way we weren't 5, even 10 years ago. So it's all those little bits that need to shift and change. More senior women in positions in terms of governance and making the decisions about where the funding goes, and access to even right down to your local rugby club, football club, who decides who plays on which pitches that weekend and who gets the new kit and who gets access to the coaching or the physio or the whatever. So it's all those different bits. And I guess that's the thing I've seen over time. It is that ecosystem and everything we're doing, having more, what difference will having more female coaches make? Well, make a massive difference to certainly huge parts of our population, and certain, for many girls want to be coached by women, that can make a huge difference. So there's all these different bits that need to come together for the change to happen. But I do feel the fact that we've got these really high profile role models showing what can be achieved, that shift has started.
Which is hugely encouraging. I'm reflecting on a guest recently I had on Extrology, Darryl Edwards, who's a wonderful man. So his kind of mantra, raison d'etre in many ways, is movement, centered around play, movement and mobility, and tackling all sorts of chronic illness, obesity, all sorts of things around movement, but trying to reflect on the playful elements to movement as adults, trying to encourage us to move more. He used the analogy of, when was the last time you ran for the bus? Actually, when was the last time, instead of running for the bus, you ran against the bus? Like, you do that stuff as a kid. He does this as an adult, by the way. But one of the things that he mentioned, and I'm going to be careful I don't now do him a huge disservice and annihilate the statistic, but it was this, I want to say 90% is the number that springs to mind. That sounds all too convenient, but 90% of UK kids, so I believe I'm right in saying that the World Health Organization mandates 75 minutes exercise per day outside as a fundamental human right for prisoners. For anyone incarcerated globally, that's the number. 75 minutes a day outside exercise is a human right. Well, 90% of UK kids spend less than 75 minutes outside per day now. So I wonder as to how much, the point I was just struck then, are we kind of, to a degree, some of the challenges around participation in sports is not necessarily a women specific, but actually societal issue, that we do have significant drop off. Kids aren't getting enough exercise and not participating. We see huge demise in sports clubs and playing fields and all these things that we hear about. Is it a societal thing, or is it elements of both?
I think it's both. I guess it's both, but also it's a societal thing that's then exacerbated by the fact that we make young girls and then women feel judged. Sport's not a place for them. They don't have the same access, don't have the same opportunities. It's not feminine to be doing that. So I had a fantastic hearing Baz Moffat talk it was one of the parliamentary committees around almost what we do with young girls. So young girls pre-primary school is almost not giving them the confidence to climb trees, to jump, to run, to walk along fences, to balance like their brothers would do. So we're like a bit protective of it's almost like us as parents, what we do to protect her daughters in that way. And then by the time they get to primary school, they then don't kick a ball, throw a ball, they don't learn to throw properly or to jump properly or to land properly well. So they're already doing things slightly differently, and the primary school teachers maybe kind of condone that or encourage that further. And then by the time they get to secondary school, and then they start going through puberty and their bodies change and they have periods and they got breasts and they're not so comfortable in their bodies, and then they haven't got the core skills because they didn't have them from a tiny age into primary school by the time they get to secondary school. And then we expect them to run around and do things that make them really uncomfortable because they're not expert at it or haven't had exposure to it. Like, it's little wonder then that they drop out. And I think when Baz talked about it, for me, it's like, I hadn't even thought about that from the very early stage of what we encourage our daughters to do, how that then feeds into what they want to do at primary school. So there's almost that thing of, the boys will be in the playground and the girls will be sat, doing games, almost like more sat together playing games on the field when the boys. But actually, is that because they haven't got the confidence, haven't been encouraged, haven't felt that this is a space for them? And so I guess my piece now, and I love that we were able to show this in the documentary, is almost like that bit of me with my walking netball and my open water swimming, is if we stop girls at that little tiny age, our little ones, of doing those things, and therefore they feel sport's not for them, they miss out for their whole life of the joy of sport and physical activity. It's much more than sport, but physical activity. And then it is around osteoporosis and bone strength and having more falls and all the dementia links, all the things that come from being physically active. So you're almost like putting them at a disadvantage from that really early stage where you stop your tiny daughter from exploring and climbing and jumping and whatever, like her brothers. And it's a much bigger piece almost, but all that comes from, and it isn't, I think sometimes I worry about using the word sport almost, because I think it puts lots of people off, because it is that overly competitive. You know, I went to walking netball last night with a lovely group of 15 women. We laughed, whatever. It is sport, but it's not, you know, we're not really, I couldn't tell you who won. We didn't actually, but I could tell you one, but it wasn't that competitive.
It was just
you
could tell me who won.
We could actually, but it's a lovely experience. It was funny. Yeah. It's lovely. So it's more about the physical activity, how it made me feel mentally. We stretched after, so it's all, that it isn't just the competitive side of sport. It's how it stays with you. And I'd love to feel like I keep doing that for another 20 years. But actually, would I do that if I hadn't played sport or felt confident playing sport? It's like we're now trying to bring women back into it. But actually, how wonderful if they'd never left it in the first place. That's a really long answer to your question.
No, I think we're going down a path I hadn't expected to go down, but I do find it really interesting. So hopefully you'll indulge me, because I think I'm interested, not least in your perspective, that what we're talking about, and it makes sense in the context of the challenges around women's sport and the rise that it is enjoying, but how far it still has to go. Because we're talking about breaking down generations of societal stereotypes. The thing that struck me is that I was having this conversation with a guest recently around standing out or not or conforming, fitting in, around the context of being a kid. So you're a very broad sweeping generalization for which I apologize, but broadly speaking, as a kid, there's that kind of fear of not wanting to stand out too much, because it comes with bullying and ridicule and all the, if you're different in some way, shape or form, if you don't do what everyone else does, you stand out. You get to a point in life where you realise the standing out is where the good stuff happens, but you do go through this spell. So I wonder, and I'm reflecting back in my own mind, Paul, I'm thinking about girls that I went to school with who were really good at certain sports, whatever that sport may be, and they tended to stand out, and they were isolated because they were really great swimmers or athletes or footballers or whatever it was. They were different, and it was like, she's different. She doesn't do what the other girls do. She'd get ridiculed for it. I think if we can encourage an environment that says, okay, to a young girl, you can do whatever you like. You can play whatever you like. Nobody's saying, oh, no. That's a boy sport. I remember my son so he's just about to turn 20. So I remember him playing. I used to coach his football team when he was 5, 6. I remember we played a team, the boys, and they were all boys. Not by default, girls could play too. Just so happens in his team, they were all boys. We played a team with a girl on the team. She was the best player on the pitch by a mile. But when we first came out, some of the boys, as we were kicking about, they were like, oh, look, they've got a girl on. They were laughing. Oh, look, they've got a girl on their team. They're going to be rubbish. We lost the match. She scored I can't remember how many goals she scored, but she destroyed these boys. And it was a real lesson for them. They came off really humbled and very much more respectful the next time we played a team with girls on it. I think that, so there are some of them you experience the shift yourself. We see the direction of travel, I think, is positive, but there's a heck of a long way to go. And I suspect it's going to take generations and discussion upon discussion upon discussion before we're going to get to a point where there is a genuine level playing field.
Yeah, and how lovely would that be if in the school I don't want anyone to be alienated, but if you were alienated because you weren't part of a team or playing sport
that's what I'm
whatever.
Thinking. You didn't play
exactly.
or you don't want to join in.
No, and actually I don't want any bullying at all. But actually, From a boy's perspective, it's the boy that doesn't do it, that doesn't play football, that can't play football, that doesn't support a team, who is alienated. But with the girls, it's the other way around. So what we want is a happy balance, but for girls to feel they can do it. And I think you're right. And it's sort of like I'm ever the optimist, positive. That is how I live my life, a bit glass half full. But in reality, this ain't going to change in my lifetime. Like, it is a shifting, but hopefully we can lay some foundations and create some conversations. And the shift is definitely coming. And I do feel, even in the last 2 or 3, even since we spoke, like things are really changing. And it's all those different levels. So there's a huge amount that needs to happen in schools anyway, just to get physical activity more ingrained within the curriculum. So we could do a whole other hour on that. You talk to someone like Ali Oliver at the Youth Sport Trust. Like, there's so much that needs to change. But we are having those conversations, and everything is kind of trickles and helps. And every now and again, you have something that comes along that makes a really big shift that everyone gets behind and says, how can that be the case? And then we see a shift and everything kind of settles behind it. So I think we've seen a few of those in the last 5 years. I
think one of the things, again, anecdotally, I should speak factually rather than anecdotally, but I speak of my experience. I know that you're part of England Rugby's diversity and inclusion advisory group. And I think that rugby as a sport strikes me as a sport that has made huge strides in levelling that playing field. Certainly from what I see at an amateur level, if I look at those clubs that are in and around my part of the world, the participant levels, the equality between teams, to your point around pitches, I don't see that. It's like everyone plays on, that's the first 15 pitch, male or female, that's the first 15 pitch, etc., etc. How do you think perhaps other sports could learn from rugby?
Yeah, I don't think it's all quite as nicely as you might say.
So that's why I'm cautious around this kind of privileged outlook, right? It's a privileged perspective I enjoy.
In some places it is really good. In some places it's better. I think if you talk to many female rugby players and those working within women's rugby, that really isn't the case. And if I look at the ICC, that the cricket report this year on I'm going to come to cricket and then talk about rugby. What was really interesting in the cricket report, I was very pleased that they called out those three big challenges for cricket and the ECB and cricket in this country were around racism, the issue of gender inequality and disparity and sexism, and then classism. It was like those three components. And I was relieved and pleased that gender was right up there alongside the other two huge issues in cricket, because sometimes I do feel almost a bit like we're gaslit. It's like the Emperor's Clothes. Like we think, oh, that's okay because it's always been that way. It's like, yeah, no, it's absolutely not right that you're paying your female players that play for England a tenth of what you're paying the male player. That can't be right, and we should not allow that to be the case. But what was interesting on the cricket side is obviously I'm so passionate about rugby and very immersed in amazing people at the RFU. Tom Malube, the chair, Bill Sweeney, and Bill Sweeney and Sue Day, who's COO and CFO. Amazing people doing fantastic things. But actually, if you took that cricket report and moved it across to rugby, you would find kind of quite similar in terms of pay of players, their contracts, and things are definitely getting better and moving, and there's only so much money in the game and all of it. But there are still some really big shifts that need to happen, and a lot that is, as you say, it's like generational. It's the people that have always known, have known no different because that's what they've always been and done. And over all the years of their volunteering in the sport, that's what the sport has always. It's been a man's sport for men, played in clubs that are run by men on the pitches. So I think things are changing, but perhaps not as fast as they ought to, or we would like to. But yeah, not to denigrate what they are doing. And actually with the Rugby World Cup coming to England in 2025, huge amount of investment from the government as well too, actually, who've backed that ability for us to host that, and the money that's going into. And one of the key things is changing rooms, which isn't particularly sexy, but investment in changing rooms. So there are places for girls to change, it's not just one changing room that they can't come and play because there's nowhere for them to change, etc. So investments like that in changing facilities, in kits, in all the coaching, everything that goes around it, I think is not as important, but it is as important as that high profile, get the coverage, getting international matches on broadcast and sponsored, and athletes being paid and being able to fly, not maybe a bit higher level of quality when they're flying, all those areas that money goes into sport.
Do you think the sort of prevailing winds of change against the pervasive attitude? So to your point, I read a lot of, there's a lot of literature, there's a lot of material around the benefits, if you like, which are undeniable around diversity and inclusion and equality, all these sorts of good things, equity, really and rightly so. But that yet there are still, and I want to come on to the Women's World Cup and Jenny Hermosa and the infamous now kiss, which even just as you're watching it as a 51-year-old man, my instant thought was, at what point did you ever think that was going to be a sensible thing to do? But I wonder as to how much, because the initial reaction seemed to be one of, well, what's the problem? It was just a congratulatory kiss, well done. I wonder how much of that kind of, all the literature, all the marketing, if you like, all the messaging, but actually underlying it all, the attitudes that need to change and the people in positions of responsibility to affect that change. That's where that's still a problem. There is still, an overarching. I mean, some of the comments that Infantino has made around the world. You see this stuff and you just think it's archaic. You're in the dark ages, but these are the people in power. Is that still there's still to your point, unstoppable rise of women's sport? There's still a long way to go to shift the dial and remove that archaic kind of perspective and attitude that prevails in many cases.
Yeah, and that's a bit the piece around governance and who's in charge of a sport, either at a club level, at a regional, national, international, global, who sits on those boards, who are the, why are those men in place in those positions for decades and decades, changing rules and regulate, we see similar in politics, don't we? But changing rules and regulations, so marrying him to Putin, but then you can change the rules and I can then keep on ruling this country until 2046 or whenever he can be in power. But it's I don't see it's that much different in sport, where we've allowed sport to regulate itself, and therefore we can have these people in positions of power and leadership. And especially after all the issues that happened with FIFA in terms of all the funding and the fraud scandal that went on, but still now we've got people in places of authority and decision making, where, and again, it's interesting about the ED&I and having equality on boards, but whether that's, obviously we know better decisions are made, but also it's the right thing to do. Why would you not? If everyone's saying football's the fastest growing area, women's football is the fastest growing area of football, it's where actually then of course you need to have better gender balance and representation of people on your boards in those decision making positions. So that's the thing that we've then seen across in Spain, but it's reflected the same, whether that's UEFA, FIFA. You look at the structure and makeup of any of those boards at the very top, who's making the decisions, and it is the same people from the same backgrounds with the same attitudes.
This is, so to your point, it's an extension in many ways. It's about governance, but it's also an extension of that ultimate power corrupts, whatever the phrase might be. But then unraveling all of that is something that needs to happen.
And that's a challenge for women's sport, isn't it? So for women's sport, so a lot of the conversations are, we don't want to replicate what men's sport. We sit within this bubble of something that's been established for the last 150, 200 years. And then women's coming in and saying, oh, we want a bit of this. We want to do this. We want equal access, funding, broadcast, all those things. But we haven't been in your space. And actually it's a space that's been made for men, by men. So can we ever really expect equality being run by men? Sometimes I think the other route is, I do a talk at the moment. I'm doing a talk at different universities and things. It's almost advocacy, activism, or anarchy. What's the way forward for women's sport is my talk. But do we need to knock it all down and start again and create something completely new that's right for women? And there's some elements of that. So Angel City and others, and actually that's exactly what happened with Billie Jean King with creating the WTA way back in the 70s. Actually, you create your own. I think the issue now is sport's gone so far. There's so much money. There's so much infrastructure. You couldn't start building stadia that were just for women. You're not going to have things completely separate, because sport is an ecosystem of itself. So you can't almost take women's sport out completely and start from nothing. So, and nor should you, because all that funding has gone into men's sport, a lot of it public funding over the years, and women, it's not about equality, it's about equity. So women are owed, you want to get it back to balance, and you've got to overinvest in that area too. So, because that's what's right and fair. So you don't want to go and create your own structure, but it's a interesting discussion in terms of where it goes to moving forward. How do you change when you're already in it's a bit of that whole square peg round hole, but how do you change what exists to make it right for the women's game? And actually the WSL, interestingly, the WSL has a bit of a chance to do that. So this new league, new code, breaking away from the FA, hopefully in 24, 25, it'll be the WSL and the Championship, but in part managed and funded by the Premier League clubs, but also a new entity. So is there a chance to do it slightly differently in a way that hasn't been done in the past? So we shall see.
I think probably the three A's to which you refer there, you need elements of all three, right?
Absolutely. The answer is, it's not one of the other. Yeah.
There's going to be some anarchy in there, and rightly so. And you mentioned trailblazing women. Billie Jean King is a great example. But your podcast, The Game Changers, you've interviewed numerous trailblazing women. It's a great phrase. Are there any stories that didn't make it onto Game On, but perhaps that you wish had?
Yeah, well, it's interesting of Billie Jean King. We did talk for a long time about whether Billie Jean King's story and the Bobby Riggs and all the rest of it should. So that almost that when you talk about the whole what's in, what's out, at one point that was in there, that whole piece around all that she did. So a bit of me regrets not leaving it having it in there, but actually if you did, then you wouldn't have had some of the other stuff that was there. I do think the cricket, I think if I was going to make more, I think definitely the power of sport in terms of sport for development and the power of sport in countries far beyond the UK to redress gender balance and change and highlight some of the societal issues. We probably didn't touch on that. I'd like to have covered on that more. That there are many. I'm very pleased with what is in it, but there probably is a lot more that we not just left on the cutting room floor, but other areas we could have explored. We need a series, really. We need a. I think some people thought it was a series, and it was only one.
Well,
so
I
we
did
need
think
a nice
that.
series of 6.
I was waiting for kind of the last dance, but I was going to be binging the episodes. You've had a long involvement in women's sport as a competitor, as an activist, as an advocate of women's sport. In your view, what are some of the most significant changes that you've noticed?
Yeah, I do feel that profile. And you mentioned earlier that anecdotal people talking about, and that's a bit I often hear, and you think that is the bit where people say, oh, years ago my friends weren't interested at all, and now they'll be texting me because the England Lionesses are through to the World Cup. So the change in society, but primarily through coverage and reporting and the ability for it to be seen, and not just being seen, but being seen in high quality production in the same way that men's sport is. So I guess that's a huge shift. It's not just it's on telly, but actually the commentators, the stats we've got around everything else is of the quality that we've seen for men. So I do think that's a huge shift. And obviously professionalism, it's easy to forget. It's only in the last decade that women have been paid to play cricket, netball, rugby, football in the way that men have for hundreds,
I absolutely. One of the things that struck me is so to your point, it's the professionalism. So then it's back to almost one of those chicken and egg scenarios. Because the thing that struck me is, so you if you're able to put more money into it, that therefore as a consequence you offer better facilities, but then that attracts better coaches who can then impart better skills and capability to the participants. So the standards raise, so the game gets better. These are all things that feed. You need one to fuel the other, to fuel the other, to fuel the other. I was actually reflecting as you're thinking. So I watched the Lionesses, I watched the Euros final, I watched the World Cup final. I wonder if I'd have watched it. The spirit of candid, perfectly candid. Would I have watched it if the England team weren't successful? That's something that springs to my mind. How much of this are we benefiting also the fact that the England women's rugby team phenomenally successful, fantastic team. So success has a part to play, and that would be true for me in any sport. So if I love cricket, I love rugby, I watched the warm-up to the men's World Cup matches and switched half of them off because I was just so disillusioned with the quality of the performance. And then I watched the first game against Argentina and thought, oh, wow, we're not as bad as I thought we were. I might watch the Japan game, and I'm back into it again. And then I watched the Japan game and thought, oh, we still won. But so success has a big part.
You're such a fair weather rugby fan, aren't you?
I'm such a hypocrite, honestly. But I think some of those, that professionalism to which you refer, I should imagine that's a significant part of the change. And the funding that is starting to come, albeit there is still an awful long way to go for parity.
Yeah. And it is interesting, that whole tribalism, I think that's kind of interesting conversation around women's sport too. So I'm a massive women's sport fan, obviously, but I'm not a fan of teams in the way that my husband might be or my brothers were growing up. So I love women's rugby, but I will follow. I'm a Loughborough fan because I went to Loughborough. I love watching Loughborough play, but I'm a Wasps fan because my daughter was on the pathway through Wasps, and I love, we worked for Harlequins for a while. And this year I love Gloucester Hartbury, and we're working now with Bristol Bears. So I just love the game, and I'll follow and support. And I probably missed off Exeter, but most of them. There aren't many that I don't support at different times. And the same for the football. Obviously, I'm a massive Lewis fan because I was on their board, and I love all that they're doing in the Championship. But actually, I'll watch women's football, and because one of the players have moved somewhere, I know what Arsenal are doing because I know Juliet well, so I might watch them. But actually, I think Emma Hayes and the Chelsea team are fantastic. So I won't watch, and there definitely isn't that hatred and vitriol to other teams. And the same for the sorry, I'm going through them all here. Same for the netball, same for the cricket, watching the 100. So I like the players, I like their stories, and I will follow the sport. And actually, even in the World Cup, obviously I wanted the Lionesses to win, but I've been really happy if the Matildas had won, because actually I watched the Matildas documentary on Disney Plus, which was fantastic, and I felt I knew the players, and in terms of what it did for a country and a nation. So for me, it's that bigger piece. It's like amazing sport, but actually, and again, I would of course wanted the Red Roses to have won the World Cup in New Zealand, but actually New Zealand women winning at Eden Park with I think half the fans had never watched women's rugby before, and what it did as a country and a nation. And for me, it's always about the difference it makes around gender equality and parity for all women and girls in society. It's not really about, it's what sport does and how it changes men's attitudes to women and boys' attitudes to go. So that's the bigger piece for me. And actually having a home country win or somebody else win or Spain winning the World Cup, and actually the conversation that's then come from that and the changes that being made that would never have happened if they hadn't won. So I do feel and I don't think it's just anecdotally of me, I do think within women's sport, sometimes we don't have that tribalism of teams. And some are concerned then that means you won't sell as much merch, you won't sell as many season tickets, because you haven't got those really core fans. But I think it's a fabulous thing to think, I'll go and watch. And actually I'll watch because it'll be a fabulous game. But I don't mind who's in it. Actually, one of my teams that I support will be there and playing well. I think that's a bit different to men's sport.
How much do you think you competed in triathlon, right? Reached a high level at triathlon. How do you think your own participants in sport has influenced your perspective on women in sports?
Yeah, good question. Interesting question. Yeah, I always say my triathlon was as an age group triathlete, so it was quite high level, but as an age group.
It doesn't matter about the age. Doesn't matter about age.
I feel like so. I guess I've never been an elite athlete, so I've always been a bit of a jack of all trades. So I was a captain of this and captain of that at school, and a bit of county athletics and county swimming. But I never, and even when I went to Loughborough, you suddenly get to Loughborough University, it's like look around, and there's all these people with national honours. So I had never really got to that level of sport. Or training. I trained a lot for swimming, but it was only to that county level. So I feel like my sporting has always been a bit of this and a bit of that, and so I've got a general interest in a lot of stuff. And it is interesting, isn't it? I'm 58 next year, but looking back, obviously I never really played football. I never really had the chance to play football. Rugby was just starting when I was at Loughborough. I do regret now that I didn't play rugby when I was at Loughborough. We didn't really have a chance to play cricket. We did a little bit on our course, but I've done a lot of the netball, the swimming, athletics things that were probably a bit more acceptable and a bit more mixed at the time. But I guess in terms of your question of how it's impacted my view I think I'm quite a generalist. I think I like a lot of stuff. It's quite funny being interviewed about sport because sometimes I'm expected to know, I can't know everything about every women's sport and every athlete and team in the way that you wouldn't expect a man that works in sport that's passionate about sport, unless he's Dan Roan or somebody from the BBC, to know about every sport. But sometimes there is almost that whole, it's women's sport, therefore you must know. And actually that's
trying to give it one overarching banner. It's like all women's sports.
Yeah, exactly. Just like all a sport, all a sport. So yes, I think the whole having been a journalist and having lots of interest in, and for me it's about the storytelling and I'm fascinated by the people and the stories and everything. So that's the piece that often interests me is those fascinating stories of the athletes and how they've got to be where they are.
I think it's just such a great analogy for life. Yeah. I had a guest on the podcast. We were talking about rugby league. He played rugby league.
Yeah.
And I said, I never really thought about this. And I made reference on the pod as to, there would be many a psychologist who was going to butcher my premise and tell me I was talking nonsense. But I was drawing the analogy of rugby league and life, that sense of you have to keep moving forward. You're going to get hit. It's going to hurt. You're going to fall down, but you have to get back up again and keep moving towards the line. And Tom, who was on the podcast with me, he's looking at me as if to say, where are you going with this, Lee? But I actually do think there are so many parallels with sport and life that offer fascinating and the emotions, the range of emotions it elicits at all levels, I think is
I have to just jump in there and say, I feel I have to give a quick shout out to Rugby League and amazing Jodie Cunningham has been the game changers. But often I taught rugby and I'm really conscious that I taught rugby and I'm talking rugby union because I'm a privileged white southern whatever where I've grown up with rugby. So yeah, amazing Rugby League. And I need to be better at making sure I also mention, I think there's those 4 core sports that I talk of and I need to make sure, because having been involved and up at the Rugby League World Cup last year and just seeing what they're doing in terms of their journey to professionalism, extraordinary, powerful, brilliant women too. So yeah, sorry. Shout out
to the Rugby League, to the other codes, all sports, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit briefly. I'm conscious of your time as well, Sue, but I wonder as to the goals and achievements of the Women's Sport Collective, which I wonder if you might share some of your insight around that.
Yeah, so it's something that we created. Kate Hannon and I, the agency I was running closed just during COVID, and we got together a group of women that we were working with. It would be nice to network on. Everyone was at home, weren't they? So networking online. So a bit of about 70 in a bit of a pilot that we ran. And then as we came out of COVID, we thought we'll continue with that. And it's really grown. So it's over 6,000 women now in the collective. So we do online networking meetings on a monthly basis, webinars, meetups, a really active LinkedIn group. And what's really exciting now is we're beginning to do these regional groups. So we've got this amazing group in Manchester that met recently. They've got 150 women in their WhatsApp group, and they met at Jill Scott's Box to Box Cafe for coffee. But they've got monthly meetings in place now. And we've got a similar one starting. We've got one in Yorkshire, in Bristol, and I'm going to miss where they are. But literally, there are 5 or 6 now that we're looking at across the country of women meeting in person, regionally, talking, sharing. So and what's lovely is that it's organically kind of grown through our members are doing that, because actually it's just Kate and I that run it. So you can only do so much as 2 people, but more of that meeting in person and learning and sharing. And just the stories. We were talking this week about how do you measure the impact that has. We know we've got really high kind of rating in terms of feedback on our in terms of the survey that we do. But actually, we would just need to highlight some of those stories of people whose lives have changed through the people that they've met, or the confidence they've got, or the roles they've then taken through the Women's Sport Collective. Yes, it's been an amazing, amazing thing to be involved with. And we are going, anyway, I'm not sure when this podcast is going out as to what I can share. When's this podcast
actually, it will be in a few weeks. And which kind of leads me on to my next question. You've sort of preempted it. Was going to be, are there any future plans or projects you're particularly excited about that you can share with us? And if you can't, it therefore now feels like a really unfair. I can share this
and you can edit it out if I can't do. But we are about to announce that Sport England, who have supported the Game Changers from the last 3 years, are going to support us moving forward with the Game Changers and the Women's Sport Collective as well too. So that's a huge piece of news for us, because a lot of what we do.
Congratulations, wonderful news.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's really exciting. I think it's almost like a testament to what we've done and the impact that it's had. But a lot of what we've done, we do things pro bono. We start like the Game Changers podcast, first 2 series, we just funded ourselves, and the similar for the Women's Sport Collective. It's not for profit. We've just done it, and actually Sky Sports have been an amazing supporter of us for the last 3 years to get us into that place. But knowing we've got that funding moving forward will be massive. So I think to really kind of continue on with that, and more, I say that more those in-person meetings and the activity that we're doing there, that's really exciting. And more of the Game Changers too then, really. So we've got series 15 coming up, and literally starting this afternoon in my first interview this afternoon. So that's kind of starting again now, and that just really excites me. There's so many extraordinary, exciting stories to be telling, and more documentaries. So we're working on a couple more documentaries as well too. I absolutely love. I love the process of creating something. I think I've realised I like making stuff and having an impact. And so, yeah, a bit more of that too. So those are kind of, I guess, the main things that will be keeping me busy in the future.
Fantastic. Well, you certainly are having a wonderful impact. And I think, so I put you on the spot, I think, with a final question. What do you think? Because I think as I read the question back to myself, I think this is just such an enormous area. Could you pin it down to one thing? But what do you think that, in terms of immediate next steps needed to achieve true equality for women and girls in sports, what do you think they might be?
I think for me, a lot of it is around leadership and governance, and who is not in control even, but around the table that's making those decisions. And that's why I think the Women's Sport Collective excites me so much, is if we can get more women and girls seeing sports an amazing place to work, so coming into sport and then feeling they can progress through, and at the same time at the top end of better governance and quotas and getting women in those places too. So I do think that is the bit that needs to shift to have the biggest change. That if we had some of those things in place, we wouldn't have the issues that we're now looking at in Spain, in football, in rugby, and whatever it is, in cricket. So, and not just that women, so it's women and broad-minded men, but people with a different, it isn't, I think it's just about putting women on boards, but definitely looking at that system. I think that would make a big difference. And I think without doubt, it's a funding and investment, whether you like the capitalist society or not, it is about funding and investment. And we are seeing that now, because we're seeing the data that exists to reassure sponsors, if they need a reassuring, that it's a fabulous place to invest, and they'll get a great return, and they'll get more than they'll get in some cases from men's sport. So I think that more sports doing that, and then the broadcasters also taking a good hard look at themselves, and print media too, and saying, actually, are we equal and fair in what we're showing? So I guess those three areas I think are where we need to see a big shift. I've got many others, but those are probably the three I think will have the biggest impact.
Well, so you're certainly having a wonderful impact, and I really appreciate you taking the time out to share some of your story, your ongoing story. Second time around, 3 years on, there's been so much that you've packed into that time, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes, because I think it's you're doing some incredible work, really meaningful, impactful work. Where can listeners go to find out more?
Yeah, most stuff is on fearlesswomen.co.uk. So I'm Sue Anstiss across most social media platforms, but at fearlesswomen.co.uk, you can listen to the podcast, you can find out about the Women's Sport Collective, the book, everything that we house is on the website. So yeah, thank you so much for having me on it again, a second time. It's
been a pleasure. I look forward maybe to series 3, episode 3, when we're talking about more documentaries, and hopefully not the unstoppable rise of women's sport, but actually kind of women's sport has arrived and where's it going now, which would be a wonderful conversation to be having. Sue Anstiss, it's been great to have you on as my guest here today. Really appreciate your time. Many congratulations for the huge amount of hard work that you're putting into what undeniably is a fabulous initiative, cause, momentum that you've enjoyed. Movement, thank you, the right word. And it's fabulous, and it's great to see. It's great that there are people like you out there making the noises you're making and having the impact that you're having. So many congratulations, and long may it continue.
Thank you so much. Just an honour to talk to you. Thank you.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to today's Extrology podcast. I really appreciate your audience and ears. If you've enjoyed it, then why not hop onto iTunes and give us a review? I'd really appreciate anything that you might have to say. Any feedback always gratefully received, and look forward to hosting you next time. See you soon. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.